Well, thank you guys for coming to my presentation. My presentation is Teaching to Different Learning Styles. There are three types of people in this world: those that are good at math and those that are not good at math. So as you can see, I'm not good. I am a social studies teacher. So my name is Tim Ramler, and I live in the Brainerd Lakes area. And I live up there with my wife Christy, and then we have a 5-year-old Gavin, and then my daughter Danica. We just ended up in Brainerd due to the job. I teach half an hour north of there, but we ended up in the right place. We love doing stuff outside. Love in the winter, in the summer, it doesn't really matter. We're always outside, so we definitely ended up in the right location. Kids, a lot of fun. They're at great ages right now, so every day is excitement. They're very goofy, silly. We love to do traveling almost every year. We try to take a trip somewhere. This was Colorado, where my brother lives. We spend as much time on the lake as we can. We just bought a pontoon this year and put it in on a slip so we can go up pretty much any night. I love sports. Whenever we travel, a lot of times we have baseball games. I've been to 12 different stadiums. And then this is the Sequoias in California. So whenever we can, we're either on the lake or trying to travel. And as far as my teaching professional life, I love history. I always have. With a lot of the trails I did growing up, places like Washington, D.C., we saw a lot of things, and I really always enjoyed the history aspects of them. And so I teach at Pine River Bacchus. I teach 5th and 6th grade up there. And it's kind of interesting because when I started teaching, I thought that the older the better. My license is 5 through 12, but I really thought I'd be more 10th grade. I want to be all like, in-depth conversations with kids. And so I always thought older the better. In my first year, I was filling in for another teacher. So I was 10th and 8th, and I also had an elective where I had some seniors and things like that. But when that teacher returned, I thought I was going to be half-time at the most. I just didn't see any way that we'd have 4 social studies teachers. But they offered me, I was able to stay full-time with teaching 6th grade. Now, how many people in here are elementary teachers? Anybody? How many are high school? One thing that I noticed is, a lot of times, high school teachers do not want to be elementary teachers, and elementary teachers do not want to be high school teachers. I don't know if you guys get that sense, but a lot of times it seems like, the high school teachers are like, there's no way I can deal with those little kids, wipe their snotty noses, things like that. And a lot of times I hear from elementary teachers, how do you deal with those kids that can talk back and things like that? And so I was very nervous about teaching 6th grade. I mean, I was happy to stay full time, but I was like, what are 6th graders going to be like? I have no idea. So I was very concerned about that. But my very first day, I asked a question, and this is what I got. Every hand goes up when you teach those younger kids. And it was very cool, and this is how pretty much the entire school year went for me. And so early on, I was like, I like the 6th grade. I mean, they're so into school, things like that. And it was kind of interesting because my first 6th grade group, I had them 2 years later when I was teaching 8th and 6th. So I had them as 8th graders 2 years later, and I was excited because I'm like, oh, this was such a fun group. Always engaged in everything. And so my very first question I asked, and when they were 8th graders, looked a lot more like this. And it was just so funny because it was the same group of kids, but man, over 2 years, how they changed. And so eventually I had the opportunity to teach 5th and 6th, and I never thought that I'd teach those younger grades, and I'm so excited to be doing 5th and 6th. I definitely think I found my niche. Alright, so how I chose my topic. When I first, for student teaching experiences, I didn't know what kind of teacher I was going to be. I don't know how you guys felt, but I had no idea. In the different experiences, the guy I taught with for student teaching was very much a disciplinarian, quiet room, things like that. And I had spent time in another room where he's more interactive. And I really had no sense on what am I going to be like as a teacher. So the district was large, and there was 9 social studies teachers. So I really spent time trying to see these other teachers, and I would take notes on things they did. And I think that turned out to be kind of a good thing because I am willing to try different things, and I saw stuff that worked for other teachers. So engagement, I would say, has been a big focal point for me. I want to have the kids be interested in what we're doing. And so that really fit with my topic, which is teaching to multiple intelligences or learning styles. And a lot of what I did was using this book. which we read for our cohort. And it looked at how people learn, and they call them multiple intelligences. I'm going to refer to it as learning styles a lot as well. But you can take this test, we did it in our cohort, and there's different types of learners, and we all learn all these ways, but we're just more skilled at various ones. And so you have people that are visual or spatial, they like to draw, do things like that. You have people that are musical, they're good at lyrics, things like that. Bodily kinesthetic, people that like to move around and be active. There's interpersonal, those are people that are very social. They learn best when they're in a group and they're actually challenging each other. So that's interpersonal. There's verbal linguistic. Those are people that, I had a student last year, if we read anything in the chapter, he would remember it word for word. And I'm not that type of person. I need to read things a few times. But I could ask him any question, any small point, and he would remember that. So that's verbal linguistic. There are people that are mathematical, logical, and then naturalistic. And then there's intrapersonal, which is, people get confused these two, but they're actually pretty much opposites. Intrapersonal are people that would be the type of people that put earbuds in and just want to be in their own little world while they're working. So they're more self-motivated, things like that. All right, so the first thing that I did as part of this, like I said, in our cohort, we took a multiple intelligence test, which is very interesting to me. I was intrapersonal. I was the only person in our cohort that had that as their main one. And so I had the students take the same one, but I found one online that was more geared towards, the verbiage is more for 5th and 6th graders. And so they would, in this section, they'd answer things like, I remember when I read or make notes, or telling or writing stories, or poetry is pleasurable. And so they'd rate themselves, 3 being very high, 0 being they're not good at that at all, and they'd give themselves a score. Then they would fill out those on this chart, and so they'd be able to graph it and they could see where they were on each one. And then I had them write about their top 3. Did they think that it fit their personality or their learning styles? And really, kids wrote a lot of interesting things on this. I didn't realize that a lot of people aren't verbal linguistic or things like that. So a lot of good conversation, they were able to see what their top 3 were. And for my purposes, I marked down their top 3 learning styles. All right, so after I had their learning styles down, their top 3, this is kind of how I set up every single unit. I wanted there to be some consistency from one unit to the next. And so pretty much every unit, we read the chapter out loud together. We would do a reading comprehension guide. Then I would teach a differentiated lesson that was directed at one of those 8 learning styles. So I tried to come up with something that was specific towards maybe visual spatial or something like that. Then we'd have a study guide, which they would have for 2 days. And then we had a unit test. There was some exceptions, which I'll talk about, but for the most part, I tried to follow the same thing in every unit. And this is just kind of a visual of that same thing. So we always read out loud. That kind of works good with 5th and 6th graders. I never did that with 8th and 10th. But it's kind of cool because you have a chance to stop and talk about things and point out things that are really important. So we always read together. The reading comprehension guides, I think, are fairly difficult. If anybody else teaches 6th grade Minnesota history, these guides can be challenging, but they really make the kids understand the material. Like, what were the reasons that the Dakota had for or against making treaties. So they actually have to put thought into that. Those are pretty challenging. Then we had a differentiated lesson. This is the fur trade game, which I'll talk about. They had to trade furs. We'd have the study guide. They'd study that night. And then the next day we'd have a review game, basketball review, something like that. And then they'd study that night, so they'd have 2 nights to study, and then they'd have the test the following one. So I tried to keep that consistent. And then the unit tests, also, I think they're pretty challenging. They really have to understand it. There's a little bit of true and false, but then they have to know things like which group prepared the skins and hides. You had Indian men, Indian women, traders, clerks, voyagers, or else questions like, describe the various people who handled the animal skin and explain what they did in the process of the fur trade. So they need to know each one. Indian men hunted the furs, Indian women turned it into or cleaned the pelt, They traded with traders. The voyagers took it out east, and it ended up in Europe and turned into hats. So there's really, on the test, there's a lot for them to remember. So I make the study guide very similar. So then they're able to, in 5th and 6th grade, one of the big goals is I want them to learn that studying is very important. So the test is very similar to the study guide, so that they're able to, if they study, they will do well. But like I said, I do think the tests are challenging overall. All right, so when I took the data, so when they took a test, I would take that data and I looked at it 2 different ways. The first one is I did traditional grading, so A's 90 to 100%, B's 80 to 89, like that. And so we looked at all 72 of my students. So I'll show you pie charts on the percent of students that got each of those grades. But then what I did, and I actually didn't I didn't think of this right away, and I went back and came up with this, but I actually compared this data to the people that just had that targeted learning style. So if they were a visual spatial learner and that lesson was directed at visual spatial learners, I just looked at those students, which sometimes were as low as only 6 of my students, and then sometimes as many as 40. So I just looked at a small group that the lesson was directed at to see how did that group compare to the entire student population. So this is an overview of the lessons I did. I ended up doing 5 different lessons. The first one, the students drew the concepts. They got to draw it. I'll show you what that was like. The second one, they acted out a skit that was directed at bodily kinesthetic learners. We had individualized learning, and I kind of modeled that more off of maybe online learning. There was less interaction among the students and more working by themselves, which was interpersonal. For the 4th unit, I actually did 2 different things. We had reenacted the fur trade, but we also read a historical fiction novel which goes along with the fur trade, which I've always done that one, and so I thought I'd include that as well. And then the last one I did was kind of a jigsaw reading where they did not read the chapter, everybody, but they interviewed each other, so they read parts, and I'll kind of show you a little bit what that one's like. So the first one was the drawing of the concept. This was directed at the spatial learner. These are students that they learn spatially. It involves a high capacity for perceiving, creating, or recreating pictures and images. And this is something that I actually did in 8th grade first. I did it with the phases of the sun, or the earth going around the sun for the different seasons. And so when you close this, there's actually 4 parts of it. And so you could have 3 closed, and then in this section, for this unit, it was the 4 archaeological dig sites in Minnesota. So there was a Jeffers site, there's an Itasca Bison Kill site, Grand Mound, and then the Bryan site. And so for each of those, they had to draw at least 5 things from the chapter. And then the hope here is, if they're a spatial learner, if they remember visually, then hopefully they'll remember those things for the test. And so when we tested on this one, you can see 34% got an A. The lighter blue is the B's. The green would be the C's. The yellow would be D's. And then the red would be the students that failed this one. And I did differentiate between the percentages too. There was a couple students that actually got 40 to 49% on this one. And so this is for all 72 of my students. Then in the next one, this right here is the same pie chart you just saw. This is all 72 students. But the one over here is just students that had visual spatial as in their top 3. And so in this case, that was 14 of my students were visual spatial. Kind of interesting, the A's were more, but we actually had more students failing of that group. Now, one thing when I look at the data, this was the very first test, and I think students didn't know what to expect. They might not know the importance and how difficult the test would be. And so this is actually where students did among the lowest scores. For the second one, this was the Dakota. For the Dakota, after reading the chapter, they actually had to create a script and act it out in a group. And the way the chapter's kind of broken up, they have divided by the seasons. So the Dakota, how they moved with each season. In the spring, they they had to go to the maple trees to tap the maple syrup. In the summer, at the end of the summer was the wild rice harvest. Autumn was getting ready for winter, things like that. And then there's also 2 oral tradition stories, kind of stories that the Dakota had to explain how the seasons occurred. You know, there's like 2 characters like North Wind and Starboy, and when Starboy's winning it gets warmer, when North Wind's winning it gets colder, so that explains how fall turns into winter. And so here's an example. They were acting out the skit, and this is one of the elders acting out or explaining one of the oral tradition stories, and then they had to act it out. This one's kind of fun because they could have various roles. Like some students, if they really didn't like speaking, they could be the teepee, for example. I also get involved in this one. I tell them that if they need to be any part, I've been a maple tree 1,000 times. I've been a bison that many times as well. So, and they always want to shoot me with the arrow, things like that. So that was kind of fun. And this one was directed at people that learn best by doing, moving, or acting things out. And this one turned out to be where students did among the best. We had, you can see the A's, B's, C's, D's, and I think only, so that'd be 2 students didn't pass it. And then if you look here, this is probably not a coincidence, but in this lesson, 39 of my 72 students had bodily kinesthetic as their top 3. So I don't think that's a coincidence, but you did see once again, A's were higher. It's kind of interesting because the other things are actually very similar, but you did see it from the body kinesthetic students, you did see higher of really understanding the material. And then of course, these 39 are part of the 72 as well. So really, if we took them out of there, all the students would probably be a little bit lower. So these students definitely did better than the general population. Then my 3rd unit that I did was more towards, like I said, this is to mimic in a way like online classes. So it was more working quietly, and I just gave them the work, then I gave them the study guide, and so they knew what would be expected on the test. Now this is for interpersonal. Like I said, that's what I was as well. And these students usually choose to work on their own. They're able to form realistic goals and conceptions of themselves. And so this one I was really worried about. I thought that students wouldn't do as well. We didn't do a review game for this one, like I did for the other units. I was kind of thinking that on an online class you wouldn't have that interaction with each other, like a review game. And so that was the only thing that I changed on this one. And I was really worried that students wouldn't do well on this one because we didn't do some of those things. And I was actually surprised. I still had a fair amount of people. Now I did warn them, this one's going to be hard. We're not going to have a review game. Make sure that you read. At this point, they'd had 2 tests for me, so I think they kind of understood what was expected a little bit more. But I actually kind of expected this number to be a little bit lower. I kind of thought, since I'm not doing as many different things for them. But one thing, so at first I was just really surprised by that, and it's just not what I expected, and not that you want them to do worse, but I kind of expected this to be one of the lower ones. But what I noticed afterwards is the students that failed by a lot more too. So like we had students that only got 30 to 39%, 40 to 49, or 50 to 59. So at least some of the students really did not understand the material at all. And another thing on this one is when I go back and we talk about things like the Dakota or those archaeological dig sites, this one seems to be the one where they know the least, and this was the Ojibwe. And it just seems like, I think a lot of students studied, did well on the test, but then as far as actually ingraining it into their memory, it seems like they know a lot more about the Dakota with the skits we did. That's just something that I've noticed in conversations throughout the year. So for this one, and just like me, I was the only student in my cohort that was interpersonal. Only 6 of my students had interpersonal in their top 3, and actually 0 students had it as their top one. Okay, which I found kind of interesting. So I think, and I often think that I think differently than a lot of people. It was interesting when we did that in our cohort, and I was the only person with interpersonal, and it kind of worked that way with the students too. So this is a small. So it's only 6 students, but of those 6 students, none of them failed. And I do think my classroom doesn't tend to be like a silent classroom. during the reading comprehension guides, it's a little quieter, but overall, there is more action or things like that, more volume in my classroom than maybe a lot of them. And it did make me think that interpersonal learners might not like that type of thing. So they might like a quiet classroom and really thrive in that environment. For the fourth one, this was the fur trade. And like I said, I had always read Broken Blade, and I thought, well, I'm not going to cut that out just because I'm doing my master's, so I thought I'll include that one. And so that one, it mostly consists of me reading to them in the final 15 minutes of class, even during the Ojibwe unit, and a little bit of the Dakota one. And so that one goes up to the verbal linguistic people. This book really goes well with the fur trade. You get a good understanding for who the voyagers were, why they were doing it. You also understand the Dakota and the Ojibwe. And so that went out to verbal linguistic. Then the other one was a fur trade game, and I divided the students into 3 groups. We had traders, there was Dakota, and there was Ojibwe. And there was a difference there. The Ojibwe had traded longer with the fur traders. And so like when we do this, their goal for the Dakota and Ojibwe, every student gets 30 pelts, and they try and barter and get as many metal goods as they can from the fur traders. And so the Ojibwe know last year's prices kind of, but the Dakota don't. And the traders know this, and so it's I try to make it realistic. So the traders are trying to get as many furs as they possibly can. And then I tell them, there's 6 traders, you want to be in the top 2. And so they really try as hard as they can to get the most. And this is really an interesting one as far as watching the students interact. Some students are really good at bartering, other students, struggle. One thing I noticed is if a student likes another student, I had that situation, pretty much gave everything to her right away. It was really kind of funny. And so he was just out. He had no metal goods left, and he had So that kind of went to interpersonal. So students that like that interaction with each other, that like the bartering stuff, that's interpersonal. And then I kind of thought it was bodily kinesthetic too, the people that are active and moving around, and they got to go from place to place and try to see what kind of prices each person was giving. So on this one, you can see the ranges. I was kind of surprised at the amount of students that failed on this one. And this is an interesting one because I had heard about this book from the person before me taught that book as well. And students, it always seemed like some students just love this book. And I thought it was all the students. But now in retrospect, I think it's just some of them like being read to, which I'll show you in a second. But so these are the scores, similar to, I guess, some of the other units. But when I looked at it, this is all 72 students. Then this one is for the 39 bodily kinesthetic. Once again, we see more students that are bodily kinesthetic getting A's than the general population. And we see that for the interpersonal as well. Some of the other ones are similar, but you definitely see more of those groups really comprehending the material. And then this is for the historical novel that we read. And this is where I kind of got that, so when I'm reading it, you don't know if the students are listening or not, and I just never really thought about that component of it before. I kind of always thought that, students seemed really into the book and loved it, and I always wanted me to be reading that. And of the students that are verbal linguistic, this is kind of what I would have expected. If you were listening to the book, there's no way that you wouldn't do well on the test because, like I said, it does an excellent job of explaining the voyager's perspective and each group that's involved. And so you did see that verbal linguistic, these people, like to be read to. 4 out of 5 of them got an A. So one way you look at it is the B's for this group turned into A's. So they were able to move up to that next one through the reading of the book. So, and that's only 11 students though that were verbal linguistic in their top 3. Now the last one's kind of an interesting one. This unit was always the most difficult for me. Students always did very, very poorly. Of all the tests that I give, this one was always the worst. And what it was is the U.S. Dakota War. And what happened was there was many groups involved with that. There was government officials, there was traders, there was traditional Dakota, that group lived like they always had. But there's also farm Dakota, Dakota that gave up their culture. They were persuaded to give up their culture and live like settlers. So they actually had a village, they farmed, they cut their hair short, they dressed like settlers did. Then you had settlers and you had missionaries. Now, like I said, by far this was the worst unit for students. There's a section where it says, like, who said if they're hungry, let them eat grass, and there's all these quotes. If the Indians had tried to make the whites live like them, the whites would have resisted, and they couldn't understand that that would be a farm Dakota, and it always kind of frustrated me a little bit. So, yeah, so this one always did very bad, or poorly, so here's what I did on this one. We actually didn't read the chapter at all together, and we didn't do a guided reading, which are things that I typically do. What students did is half of the students were witnesses, kind of, so they had to read about their group. So there was like a settler named Mary Swant, and so one person is Mary Swant. One person is a trader, and so the traders sometimes cheated the Dakota because they didn't keep records, and the traders did, or the government personnel didn't give them money that was promised in some of the treaties. And so students, half the students were these witnesses. And I made sure that they knew what they had to. They kind of were guided, like go to this page, read that, and I kind of gave them some tips on what they should know. And then I also sat down with the groups and made sure that all the students had written down what they were supposed to. And the other half of my students were agents, and they were paired up. And so they had to go to each person, and they had to interview them on what they had seen, what happened to them, their involvement. And this was really, really fun. I've been doing this one for about, I think this is my 3rd year, and that I've done this one, and it definitely turned this unit from being one of the most difficult to actually students did really well. Students still get it. It's kind of funny, whenever we talk about this, you still have a student that was Little Crow, which is a traditional Dakota, and when we say something about the war, he'll say, yeah, but the government, all of a sudden that student will just say, yeah, the government didn't give us our money like promised, or else the person that was government official, they'll actually kind of defend their position as well. So even afterwards, they remember who they were in the discussions. And then at the end of this unit, every student wrote a letter to Lincoln. That actually somewhat is accurate too. At the end of the U.S. Dakota War, there was 303 Dakota that were sentenced to be hanged, but by law, they had to have Lincoln's approval. And so he did look over all the cases, and he dropped that number down to 39. But so I told them, and they don't know what Lincoln's going to decide. They just know that Lincoln has to look over and understand what happened, and should these 303 Dakota be hanged or not. So they all write a letter. The students that were a witness, they give it from their perspective, and they give some of their points, but then they also explain the other groups and how they affected them. Now, the agents, they've got to say each group and their level of guilt, kind of, and how they contributed to it. And these letters are really unbelievable. Like, I mean, there's some students that write 8-10 pages on this and really get involved in it, and all students write 2-3 pages. There's almost no way that you can't write at least that. But throughout the whole unit, I just saw a level of engagement, even from students that typically aren't engaged in class. They really enjoyed being the trader and when having people come up to them and saying their side of it. So that was a fun one. And in this one, it was really hard. Like I said, I'm not going to change the way I teach just because I'm doing the master's thing, but when I look at this, I think I kind of hit all these, mathematical, logical, those people that like to have the logic part of it where they can see a perspective and understand a perspective on it. They went out to the spatial learners, verbal linguistic, especially when they're writing the paper part of it. I also thought, so interpersonal, those are the relationship between people. The bodily kinesthetic, getting up, moving around, going to the various people. And then I also think it was interpersonal too, because these are the people that like it quiet. During the writing time, it was quiet in there, and everybody's just in their own kind of world, writing about their letter to Lincoln. And then, of course, at the end, I got to dress up like Lincoln, the shortest Lincoln you'll ever see. But I got a hat, I got the beard, and then I explained them what I found. And that's a lot of fun, too. There's like a student that said, at the very bottom, on the letter to Lincoln, and P.S., I suggest not going to any plays anytime soon. So that was kind of fun. So very creative on the students. And so then I brought that up. I was like, I like plays, though. I still plan on going. So a couple of things. Positive results that I saw is I think in every lesson that I did, the directed learning style, the people that I was hoping would do better, they did do better. So in every one, some of the failing students were the same percentage and stuff, but you definitely saw some of those B's turn into A's where they really understood the material. I also think I saw a wide variety of students that had success at different points. So, you know, some students that maybe lacked effort or weren't very involved, let's see here, you know, they were involved in certain ones. In the flip fold square or some of the other ones, the students want to do those again. And with the school year, it's hard to do some of those things. But a lot of students were like, can we do a flip fold square on this? And so, you know, I am trying to think of a way maybe where I just let them choose what they want to do. But so, another one, this is a big one that I've noticed in the letter to Lincoln since I've been doing it. And this may be hard to quantify, but as teachers, we often have those students that work really hard, but get a B. Like, you see them, they always, you know, they want to do well. You know, when you talk to them one-on-one, you know, they'll be like, I did study, you know, things like that. And what I found there is, like, in the letter to Lincoln, that's one I noticed even from 2 years ago when I started doing that one, is that some of those students that work really hard but just can't quite grasp it, it seems like on that one, they really did, and you saw some of those people turn into A's and be pretty excited about that. Other things, now I'm more intentional about teaching to a variety of learning styles. This isn't something I did before. We have a teacher that I used to work with that now teaches 6th grade somewhere else, and so he teaches the same class I do. And he had sent me this like 2 or 3 years ago, like for the letter to Lincoln. When I developed that one, I sent that to him, and he actually created a rubric for the letter to Lincoln. And then so we've been kind of working together to make that one better. And so we send things back and forth. And he had sent me this one a couple years ago, and I just can't ever seem to find the time for it. Creating a wigwam. And so this year I was like, well, yeah, you know, I'm not really reaching out to those naturalistic learners. So we actually went out to our school forest, and I told them no taking any birch bark off of live trees, but we could take anything we wanted, you know, on the ground for trees that had fallen, things like that. And once again, you saw some students that typically maybe don't do real well in school, but they made some of the most unbelievable, you know, wigwams. Spent a lot of time on it, worked on it at home, maybe went out to their own forest somewhere. And, you know, and that's another one is going out to some of these like musical, I really struggle with that. I wasn't able to really come up with anything musical. I'm going to look for ways. But naturalistic, when I looked at the naturalistic learners, some of them are they do poorly in all their classes, but a lot of them had naturalistic as their top one. And so it did kind of make me think as a teacher, you know, maybe they would do well if they were more hands-on. Those are students that you know, might be great bow hunters because they're able to go out and do it, and they practice it, and they do those things. But in school, maybe we're not able to be more like outside and doing some of those things. So that was definitely a good one. And like I said, I've always put this one off, and I probably would have taught, you know, this class 10 more years, and it probably would have been the one that I cut out every time. But now after doing it, I think the kids enjoyed it, and I think that I reached other learners. Now that's not something that I tested on. Another thing I noticed is I think that students were more engaged in my class. I did hear more people say things like, you know, I like the fact that I never know what we're going to do. It's not like every unit the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. Other things, you know, in retrospect, after doing this, you know, maybe the study guides actually were the most important factor in their success. So it could have been that the differentiated lesson didn't help them at all. It was all, you know, if you're a good studier, you're good at studying, and you have a study guide for 2 days, you know, even if you had missed that lesson, you know, that's just something that I thought about as far as, you know, if you have good study habits, or if you're a verbal linguistic person, you're gonna, all the lessons still reached out to those people. So, other small classroom environment adjustments, this one's actually really interesting to me. I never allowed earbuds. I kind of always thought, you know, during work time, I hear students say other teachers allow earbuds, and I always wanted them more, like I always thought they were off in their own little world. But what's really interesting is in this master's program, whenever we got work time, I would go off and I put my earbuds in, listen to Bob Dylan, and it wasn't even to listen to music. it was more that, you know, other people are being social and chatting and stuff like that, and I just wanted to get my work done. So it was more just putting myself in my own little world to get the action research paper done. And I had never allowed that for my students, and I just never thought about that until doing this. And so now I've actually changed small things like that. You know, interpersonal learners, like I said, it's not necessarily even that about them listening to music, which is what I thought. It's more that if students are talking, they're able to concentrate more on what they're doing. So that was an interesting one that came up throughout. There was actually more lessons that I did, but I didn't test on them. So there was other ones, essential questions, which are questions that are not, they're more open-ended. There isn't just a right or wrong. And I actually did implement that one, but I got to the point where I was like, I just tested them on the Dakota chapter, or the archaeological dig site, the Dakota, the Ojibwe, the fur trade. And so then we get to the sixth one, and I'm like, I just felt like I over tested them a little bit more than I normally do. So I did implement these ones, but I never got any assessment on it because I didn't just thought it was a little bit much. So we also used a photograph to kind of learn about the material. In another one, we created a town, and they got to hang that on the wall, and that was more for the visual learners, which I did have some feedback on that too. Like a couple of the kids said they like how much they get to draw in my class for the artistic people. You know, another one, this one takes a long time. It has to do with when the settlers moved in, and so they got to create a town, and they got to think about main streets and how you put businesses on main streets, and also location. They had a little map, and they had to choose their location. There's roads and rivers on that map, and so they randomly were either the first group chosen or the last. And so I always thought this had a really good one, but I almost cut this one out because it just takes way too long, and I thought they're not really learning the objectives of the chapter. But I mentioned once that I was going to cut that one out to a 7th grader, and they're like, that's the best thing that we did, or I really enjoyed that. And so, you know, sometimes, so that was another thing that I got out of this. You know, I want to cut things out because they're time consuming, but really, you know, if they remember that years down the road, you know, that's probably a good thing. Other things that I thought about throughout the whole process is there is uncontrollable variables. Like I said, that first test, the flip fold square, I actually think that students probably would do better if I had done that in a different unit. But it was the very first one, so I think a lot of students may have showed up that test without studying at all. They didn't realize the importance and how difficult the test would be if they didn't. So you always have some of those things. Also, what if a student was absent and missed the fur trade game, or if they missed a lot of time and they were missing the reading of Broken Blade? So if they had missed those things, then really, you know, we don't know how that part did at all. Or else, of course, students have other things going on. They have something going on in their life and they're not able to study at all. Either of those 2 days, they're going to do poorly no matter what their learning style is. Like I mentioned this one earlier, but I don't think that I do or schools do a very good job of teaching those naturalistic learners. Like I said, some of the lowest students that do poorly in a lot of classes, I just noticed those students were naturalistic. But like I said, some of those students are very bright in other ways that I can think of. But what was interesting is some of the highest end students were naturalistic as well. So it's not like naturalistic was just students that struggled. But I did notice a segment of struggling students that were naturalistic. Other things, I've been doing some of these lessons for several years, like the skits I've done since the beginning. And I do have other social studies teachers mention how when they bring up something, the students recall that from the class. And every time that happens, it seems like it is one of these differentiated lessons. It's not the ones where we didn't do that. It's more, you know, when they talk about the bartering, they remember the fur trade game, things like that. So it does seem to be the differentiated lessons that are the ones that really ingrain those a little bit further. So the 3 books that I use and I recommend if you're interested in this topic, So Each May Learn is a very good one for understanding learning styles, what it's like, how to implement different lessons for each one. Another one that we did in our cohort was total participation techniques. This goes out really well to social studies for me, but it could probably be implemented in other classes as well. But it's ways to make students interested in different types of lesson plans as well. So I used some ideas out of this one. And this is a book especially if you're social studies, but in any case, I would recommend getting, this isn't one that our cohort read, but last year when I came to this, one of the other cohorts that were presenting, I saw it a bunch of times, and it's called Teach Like a Pirate, and it says increase student engagement, which is kind of a big thing for what I try to do. It says boost your creativity and transform your life as an educator, and it's got some pretty good ideas on things like that, so I definitely strongly recommend this one. If you have, I didn't give you a handout with this, but if you want to write down, if you have any questions on any of these lesson plans, I'd be happy to share them with you. A lot of what I did here, I had implemented in my 5th grade as well. So especially, once again, for social studies teachers, but I think it might work with science and things like that. Like I said, that flip fold square works great for any time that you have 4 different things the students are learning about. But I'd be happy to show you that. I could email you the directions. They're actually on my website for a lot of them. But it's Ramler@prbschools.org. Is there anybody in here that teaches 6th grade Minnesota history? Just curious. You know, that letter to Lincoln one, if you're interested in it, I got it pretty well laid out as far as what the kids need to do. And like I said, I have a friend in Pillager, I have a cousin that teaches in Rogers, and I shared it with them as well, and they've been doing it. So if you have any interest in any of that stuff, and you email me, I'll definitely get it to you. But I think a lot of these, like I said, now I've been doing the exact same thing in my 5th grade class. So I think any history teacher can implement virtually all of these, as long as you find a chapter, like, you know, that shows like chapters that show different perspectives. That would be good for the interviewing one. And then the last thing, when I came across my topic, and since I've been implementing this, this was a quote I came across, and it does fit really well with what I've been doing. It's attributed to Albert Einstein, some people dispute that, but in any case, I don't think it makes it any less true if it was said by Albert Einstein or if it was not. But it says, everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that's stupid. So that's just something I came across as I was doing this, and I kind of thought that really hit with what my presentation was about. So, let's see, I think that's it. Yeah. Thank you for coming. Does anybody have any questions at all on any of it? Yeah.
We teach with Tim, so we know that he's very good at what he does, and his kids love his class. But I want to know where you get your ideas for your specific activities. Is it from your curriculum, or is it something that you go out and look for online? Or
the Northern Lights one is actually pretty good. I'm kind of glad that I teach that, because that had like the creating a town, and some of those things I've modified, but a lot of it started there. And like I said, now I've been doing that same things in my 5th grade. Some of them I did come up with, like, I should have probably mentioned this, but on that Dakota War one, like I said, I just struggled. The kids just did not get it. And I looked at it and I said, oh, well, what if I make these people the different groups? And I thought about it, and it's kind of fun because at the very beginning, I just asked them, do you guys watch any TV shows at all where you have people that have to solve a crime? And you can just think in your head right now, if I did that right now, we could probably get a list of 100. I mean, you have all the CSIs, NCIS, Law and Order, all those. And so we start off the unit by saying that part. And then I asked them, how do the people in these shows solve these crimes? And then they say things like forensic, but then we get to the part of, you know, they usually go around and they interview people and find out what happened. And so that's kind of how I connect that right at the beginning to what we're going to do here. And I talk about how, you know, with this war, you're going to have to go around and find out and kind of solve it for yourself. And I think rather than just reading the chapter, students like the fact that their brain's going on this. Like, they get to say, and I get various things. I get people that say, you know, the Dakota killed settlers, you know, and I tell them, you know, put what you think. You know, some people put different levels of guilt. Some people say, I think the government officials were the biggest ones. I mean, yes, what the Dakota did was wrong, but however, they were promised all these things that weren't followed upon. So, so that one, I mean, I just kind of stopped and thought about it. The flip fold square, actually, my wife came up with that one. She's sitting in the back, and I was like, how the heck can I teach this? It's just gonna seem like it's gonna be boring. The sun going, or the Earth going around the sun. And she's very creative, and she actually came up with that one. So that was a fun one. And like I said, so I did that in 8th grade. I've turned it into something for 6th grade. I've turned that into something for 5th grade. Anything where you have 4 objectives, it works real well.
So do you feel like you've always taught this way, or like you've been becoming more hands-on?
More, I'd say more, definitely. Every year, I try to make it better. And I don't think that my 5th grade is quite here yet. I think that my 6th grade is, I have more of these things. And so, yeah, I think it's been more, definitely, you know. Like I said at the beginning, A lot of it had to do with going into these different teachers. There was a teacher that I went into, and he does nothing but lecture, which people typically frown upon and coming out of college. As a college student at the time, a lot of people said you don't do that. However, his class was pretty engaging, and students wanted to be in his class. And so I sat down in his, and the way that he spoke, and he did add a little bit of music to it, but he was up there talking most of the time, and the students were just taking notes, but it seemed pretty engaging. But the one thing on that, there was students that looked bored out of their mind, but overall, I think he was good at it, and I don't think it's something that I could do, but it was something that he was good at. Yeah.
So you said you wanted to be more intentional with trying to teach this way now. Do you find that you're wanting to teach to like your last one where you hit a whole bunch of the learning styles within one? Is that like your end goal is to get like all of them met within each unit, or where do you go from here?
I think that would be tough to do for every unit, but I definitely realized that in teaching that one, how many I hit and how well the students remember it and things like that. I do see the correlation there. So I do think it's good for teachers to look at ways that they can do things. Or like I said, I don't do musical at all, and I don't do naturalistic often enough, things like that. So things like school forest that a lot of schools have, in our area anyway, it is worth hitting some of those things. So I think that is, that's where I hope to do more of it. I still don't want to do the musical. I'm going to have Nick help me.
But think about, even if you just did some musical and some nature sometimes, the kids would be more engaged in your class overall because they know they're going to get opportunities to.
Yeah. And I have it, like my nephew in Colorado, he mentioned once they had to create lyrics or a poem or something like that. I think it was lyrics for something, and I haven't implemented that, but that is almost reaching out to the musical type of people. Yeah. But please feel free to email me if anybody is interested at all. I really like it. Like I said, I got my cousin and another friend doing this class, and we do a lot of back and forth, and we're able to really help each other out and things like that. So the more especially for the 6th grade Minnesota history teachers, there's a lot of cool things that we've been implementing.